that I have been participating in since taking up in mid-May as CEO of the Wheel. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm also very happy to be welcoming Brian Harvey once again. Brian has been providing us with post-budget analysis of a sound and solid basis for many, many years now, and it's one of the highlights of the Wheel's annual calendar. So welcome, Brian, and looking forward to hearing your input shortly. This year is, I think, a somewhat extraordinary year for the community and voluntary sector, given the context that many Section 39, Section 56 and Section 10 organisations providing health and social services, child and family services and homeless and housing services are potentially facing in the context of the strike action that has been served. And before we hear Brian's analysis, it's appropriate that I just say, I suppose, a few words in relation to that. There is, for those of you who may not be aware, I'm sure everybody is, there has been a lot of media coverage of the circumstance lately, and indeed there were good discussions in the Dáil yesterday in relation to it. There is potential indefinite strike action being called for Tuesday the 17th of October. This is an extraordinary circumstance that will impact tens of thousands of people nationally who depend on voluntary organisations for their services. We are asking government to make the necessary funding available to ensure organisations have the ability to pay staff adequately and address the recruitment and retention crisis in the sector. As I said, there's been a lot of coverage in recent weeks of the crisis, and the Dáil did debate the question, and there have been calls from all parties across the board and within the governmental parties for this situation to be sorted out. We now need to see government recognise the essential nature of the services provided by Section 39, 56 and 10 organisations, and that sufficient funding be made available to enable equal pay for equal work. I would go as strongly as that. That is what we believe is required at this point. So, while the increase, which we'll be hearing about from Brian, and I don't want to preempt Brian's presentation, while the increase in the total funds available to charities through the VAT compensation scheme, which is increased from 5 to 10 million, is very welcome. It was one of relatively few bright spots in an otherwise disappointing budget for the work of the community and voluntary sector. There's much good analysis of the budget also as it impacts individuals and families available from Social Justice Ireland's analysis and from the analysis of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul and many other analysts. And there is, welcome for increased investments that the government has made in many areas and analysis of the potential impact in particular on people reliant on social welfare, etc., elsewhere too. So just to note that we sought tens of millions of euro to urgently resolve the funding disparities for statutory funded Section 39, 56 and 10 organisations and to put the work of the community and voluntary sector on a sustainable footing. But there unfortunately appears to have been no significant increase in funding for services. So, in this somewhat dispiriting context, I wish to just everybody here to rest assured that we will continue to take every opportunity that presents to press for the increase in funding and developmental supports that are needed in the sector, to raise awareness of and respect for the vital work of the sector. And that we'll redouble our efforts to secure changes like securing multi-annual funding and working to drive down insurance costs. And I just wish to note that as a leadership organisation, it is our job to keep spirits up. So in looking at the positives, and despite some of the above, there are many positives, we are looking forward to working with the department and government in general in relation to implementing the two new government strategies that are on the way in the area of philanthropy and social enterprise, both to be published before Christmas, we understand. And we'll be looking forward to working with our members in these new contexts. And hopefully, if government does what needs to be done in a new context for the funding of essential services provided by voluntary organisations, and importantly, in a new context that deals with this issue in a sustainable way, creating proper permanent linkages between the pay increases that are needed in the community and voluntary sector for the sector to retain the staff that it employs and people doing equivalent work elsewhere. We need to end this two category approach to how we do essential services in Ireland, and address this issue once and for all. And I'm calling on government to do that. So it was appropriate that I make those particular statements, Brian. I hope you understand that in the extraordinary context that the sector finds itself in. And I hope I haven't preempted some of your analysis. I'm very much looking forward this morning to hearing the analysis. And over to you, Brian, at this point. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. What I'm going to do now is, if people can hold on for a moment, we'll get my presentation PowerPoint ready. Okay, I need to check with you, please. Can people see the slides at the moment?
Yep,
yes.
We're all good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're ready to go, are we?
We are.
Okay, let's go ahead then. I'm going to first of all give you the big picture on this year's budget. My presentation, as always, may be broken down into two parts. The first part is, how does it affect those who are served by voluntary and community organisations in the social and health field primarily? But second, what have been the changes, or what can we imagine will be the changes for the funding of voluntary and community organisations themselves? First, I want you to give you the big picture, which is of three shocks to the Irish economy and the voluntary and community sector. The first, and I do insist on coming back to this, was austerity in 2008. Many economists, if you raise the issue of austerity, they would say, oh, that's long ago, far back in the past, and has no particular relevance to the present day. Not for us. Because after 2008, voluntary and community organisations lost 35 to 45% of their funding, 31% of their staffing, and as Ivan has just pointed out, a huge legacy of Section 39 organisations who were required to accept the cutbacks and the pay reductions and the reductions in terms and conditions in 2008, but have not been permitted to share in their restoration since then. So austerity still has a very long shadow that still impacts on us very much to this day, and will particularly do so next week. Second, there are still effects from COVID, even if the medical effects have worn off. There were severe effects on the fundraising of voluntary and community organisations at a time when they faced increased demand, not reflected in the fullness of the compensatory package. And indeed, this government is still allocating funding to dealing with COVID. And I've spotted my first typo, which is that 1.3 million should read 1.3 billion in 2004. So it is still costing the Irish state money to deal with COVID. And could I just say that the slides will be available as corrected afterwards, along with the text, the full text of what I'm saying this morning. And then the next issue is the war against Russia, which has had many consequences for inflation, about which we'll speak a lot. The arrival of significant numbers of refugees, 94,000 up to this point, a budget allocation of 2.5 billion in 2024, but the arrival of significant numbers of refugees has, in its own way, had a significant impact on voluntary and community groups working in the field of refugee and related provision. So that's very important for one part of the voluntary and community sector. To go on to the bigger financial picture, the low point in government spending in 2008, which is our anchor point, was 53.4 billion. That fell to 49.6 billion in 2014, but it is now over 81 billion. So government spending is now up over half on what it was in 2008. And our question is, has that been reflected in the funding of voluntary and community organisations and who they serve? So as I said, I'm going to look at the social impact of the budget and then set against the baseline of 2008, the funding of voluntary and community organisations themselves. If we look here, this gives, I think, a better idea of the recovery of government spending. Starting again at our anchor point at the beginning, 53.4 billion, falling to 49.6, and now up at the present time to 81 billion. If we look at the welfare provision in the budget, this divides into two. The first one is general increases. The second one, about which I'll speak in a moment, is cost of living, inflation, and energy-related measures. There is a €12 across the board payment, and I'm putting the figures afterwards because that'll give you an idea of their cost, or put it more positively, the value of these changes and what the government considers the most important, because the amount allocated is the best indicator. An across the board increase is generally better for those on lower rates compared to percentages, because it closes the differential across the entire range, and it is €12 for all those on receiving the principal social welfare entitlements. Child benefit is extended to those over 18 in education. There is a significant extension of school meals to non-DESH schools. Those are disadvantaged area schools. And there are small amounts there in pay-related benefit for job seekers, free travel for those under 66 uncertified to drive, possibly because of sighting issues, an increase in the disregard for carers allowance, an increase in domiciliary care allowance, an increase in the qualified child allowance, a very small increase in the threshold for working family payment, and an increase in the parents' benefit by 2 weeks. So those are the main headline changes, which have been well advertised at this stage, and I don't intend to add to that. There are very specific interventions in the area of the cost of living, inflation, and energy related. First of which, there are 3 energy credits of €150 each, the cost of which to the state is 900 million. There is a second double week for those on the main social welfare payments. There is a single double week for those on child benefit, an issue to which I'll return in a moment. There is an increase in fuel allowance of €300 once off. And then the other ones, which are generally smaller, are an increase in the living alone allowance by €200, the qualified child increment 100, a reduction in student fees and related educational costs of 1,000. That is actually quite an interesting one, about which little comment has been made, but it is a recognition of campaigns, for example, by the Union of Students in Ireland to address the severe pressure on students and student poverty. There are increases for the foster care allowance, youth travel, the keeping of the 9% VAT rate for gas and electricity, and a delay in the reimposition of diesel and petrol tax. So those are the 2 put together, and their value we'll take a look at in just a moment. The budget statement has calculated, first of all, on the left, the critical issue of what will be the level of inflation. And you can see how it peaked in the latter months of last year and is now falling. But obviously we cannot be certain as to the degree to which that will be maintained or not. The government is predicting 5.25% inflation this year and 2.9% next year. But the actual real value of the increases about which I've just been speaking will not be absolutely known until the inflationary figures can be seen and worked out. The government, though, has calculated the benefit of the overall measures. They say that they average 2.1%. These are the main measures. And if you divide all the income groups in the country into deciles, in other words, 10%, 10%, 10%, those who earn most will benefit by 1.4%. Those who will benefit least will benefit by 4.4%. Lone parents are considered to be the principal beneficiary group, and they will benefit by 3.8%. If you look at the cost of living and energy measures, the top decile, those who earn most, will benefit by 1.9%. Sorry, excuse me, let me say that again. There'll be an overall benefit of 1.9%. The top decile will benefit by 0.6%, but the bottom decile by 6.6%. So the intention of the budget is to be socially progressive and ensure that those on the lowest incomes, the lowest decile, benefit the most. And those are, for what they're worth, the government estimates and predictions as to how that will work out, but they will, of course, depend on the actual rate of inflation to come. If we look at some other changes that are here, there is a increase in the, and there are two sides. There are some smaller issues and some larger issues on the right. On the left-hand side, there is an increase in the minimum wage by €1.40 an hour to €12.70. There's an increase in the PAYE credit. The main tax threshold, and this is the main tax measure of the budget, is up from 2,000 to 42,000. There is, for the first time for 5 years, a reduction in the universal social charge, which is, of course, added to all our taxation, and a small increase in PRSI. There is an extension of the free books scheme, €39 million worth. There will be 1,216 more special needs assistants, bringing them to 21,600, and an increase in special education teachers by 744, costing 27 million. On the right-hand side, one of the most interesting features of the budget was the introduction of two special funds. The first being the Future Ireland Fund, which is to grow to 100 billion by 2035, to be set aside for living standards, public services, health, pensions, home care, and ageing. And a €14 billion fund from windfall corporate taxes for climate and nature, of which climate and nature will be 14 billion. Perhaps the most important thing is not so much what they're about as the fact that it at last breaks the approach of most governments in Ireland, which is cyclical spending. Cyclical spending can be summarized by the phrase of, I think it was a former Minister of Finance who said, if I have the money, I spend it. And if I don't, I don't. This has been the way in which very few other governments in Europe have worked, because what they have done is when there is more money coming in, as we have now, they have set aside the money so that austerity type events are much less severe in the future. We never did that, which is why austerity was as impactful as it was. So this is a very, very, in my view, welcome recognition by the Minister and the Department that we must break the cyclical pattern and do what other good European governments do, which is anti-cyclical spending. In other words, we save money when it is coming in so that when there is a financial shortage, the impact of that may be cushioned in a way that it never was in 2008. I'm going to come on now to the actual value of the welfare increases. And the first thing we need to look at is the relationship between the budget allocations and poverty. Poverty rose last year to 13.1%, above from its previous level of 11%, although it is still well below its worst post-austerity marker of 16.7%. But the poverty line is €301.91, which is the standard European measurement based on 60% of median income. And if you look at the actual level of payments, and I've put them out here, all social welfare benefits are below the poverty line. They do not lift anyone above the poverty line. And you can see there the figures of the highest welfare benefits going to pensions, contributory first, non-contributory second. They're in the range 266 to 287. And then you come on to disablement benefit, carers benefit, invalidity pension, the one-parent family payment, which is very significant because single parents have been identified as one of the groups most vulnerable to poverty. Then if we look at people who are out of work, their level is 232, and the most basic payment of all, supplementary welfare allowance, is 230. I should have come back a moment ago to refer to disablement benefit and the disability-related benefits, because they're somewhere in the middle of the range. But again, that is a group where poverty has been identified as one of its most definitive features. Essentially, the differentials that were there last year have been largely preserved, except that there has been a minor benefit from across the board increase rather than percentage increases. The point here that I think is critical is that in the past, governments have pushed ahead certain levels of benefit to provide improvements, for example, for older people and for children in poverty. But there is no evidence of the budget being used in that strategic way this time. And you can see there in that graph, the proportions below the poverty line. You can see there the poverty line 14.1% at the start of austerity, and then it's gradual decline back, but an increase in the past year. So there is still a very significant issue of poverty, as I think we can all understand here, and we don't need persuasion of that. But one particular thing to which I will draw attention to is the issue of child poverty, which is above the general level of poverty. And if we come to the bottom of the slide first, early in the 21st century, child benefit was pushed ahead on the recommendation of the Combat Poverty Agency to try achieve improvements in the level of child poverty and to reduce it. Although this budget still now has a single double week in January 2024, it is nevertheless the case that the value of child benefit now is still less than what it was before austerity. In other words, it has not improved. The value of child benefit in this coming year will be 1,820 compared to the 2009 level of 1992. So if child poverty is as high as it is, that is a function of the budget not being used as the way it was in the past to reduce levels of child poverty. I'm going to come on now to specific areas of spending that affect voluntary and community organizations, starting with health here. If we look at the health budget, the overall budget is up from 20.9 billion to 22 billion, but the critical issue is the HSE budget, from which the voluntary and community funding may be found. The HSE budget is up from 13.25 billion to 14.12 billion. That's up 6.6%. In the past, voluntary and community organizations have generally benefited proportionately from increases in HSE funding. And if we do not have a predicted funding level for voluntary and community organizations in this field for next year, so we have to go back a bit to the HSE annual reports, which do provide such figures, which showed voluntary and community sector funding at 6.83 billion in 2022. But, and this is important, this includes many large hospitals and related services that would be provided by the state in other European countries. And as Ivan has just pointed out to you, there are no specific proposals in the budget to address the situation of Section 39, voluntary and community organizations, which are still, insofar as their staff are concerned, being funded at the same level as 2008. What is also important is that Ireland remains the only European country without a national health service. And this is particularly impactful because it means that because we do not attempt to have such a service, that some groups are particularly effective. And I would recommend you look at the Economic and Social Research Institute reports looking at the particular poverty trap that is created for those who are just above the level of medical card entitlement, and how that group particularly forgoes medical health care simply because it cannot afford it. And in particular, children in those families are very much put at risk as a result of doing that. If we had a national health service, that will not happen. The government flagship project for addressing this particular problem is Sláinte Care, which was announced many years ago, but the total budget allocated to Sláinte Care is only 16.9 million for its reforms, the same as last year. So, which suggests that progress toward a European standard national health service is as far off as ever. If we look at housing, I'm going to spend a bit of time on housing, not least because the minister himself described it as the biggest challenge facing us, the biggest domestic challenge. Here, funding for housing is up 9% from 3.66 billion to 4 billion. But if you look at the measures, they are mainly in the private sector. They are an increase in rent tax credit, an extension for rent-a-room, relief for small landlords, new housing assistance payments for the private rented sector, with a very substantial cost, 525 million, that's $500 million for 74,000 tenancies, with a further 1,400 tenancies in the rental accommodation scheme, that's another 111 million, and 3,130 leased homes. So is the government spending a lot of money on housing? Yes. But is it being directed in such a way as to reduce the pressure on those on low incomes and those who are homeless? And I think that is the primary concern of voluntary and community organisations. And here we look at funding for local authority housing, which was traditionally the principal instrument of the government to assist those with low incomes. Local authority housing has been falling in construction numbers in the past few years. It's down from 2,271 in 2020, 2,230 the following year, 1998 the previous year, and now 1,666. In addition, voluntary housing associations delivered 4,949, and that's a total of 6,615. But as you can see, that's a lot less than the total at the top left of the figure, which was local authority housing construction in 1984. The minister himself has estimated that there will be 9,300 new build social homes in the coming year. But it's very difficult to see that from those figures. It would require an expansion of almost half. It's worth remembering that the local authority housing programme was cut radically in the 1980s, as you can see on this chart, and never effectively recovered. Local authority construction fell by 99% over the years from 7,002 to 75. The housing waiting list rose, as you can see, from 17,737 in 1998 to 57,842, the most recent figures available, and that's after some significant modification of the list. In a sense, it's little surprise that we have a housing and homelessness crisis when the principal instrument for addressing it was largely taken out of the system. And if we look here, I've set this in long-term historical context. This is the pattern of local authority housing construction since the Second World War. And as you can see, there have been peaks there of 7,700, 8,700, 7,002 in the 1980s, a recovery up to austerity, which I think makes the point about the importance of the austerity event in 2008, and a dip back down to in 2014 to a mere 75 houses, and then a slight recovery, falling back again. So the outcome of this is inevitably going to mean increased pressures on housing, which will impact on voluntary and community organisations, and particularly on homelessness. And if we look at the homeless figures, the government has increased the level of funding for homeless organisations. It's up from 215 million to 242 million. But if there is one thing I think on which everyone can agree, including probably the government itself, homeless services are no substitute for housing. Are they life-saving? Yes. Do they address the fundamental problems of housing shortage? No. It's also worth remembering that although non-governmental organisations, NGOs, have the profile of homeless services, 2/3 actually goes to commercial providers. Also, if you look at homeless figures over the years, one of the important things that we can see is that homeless figures were traditionally in the 3,000 level. 100 years ago, there were 3,257 people homeless. That figure was essentially stable until 2014, when there were 3,738 people homeless. The most recent figures are 12,847, which I think gives you some idea of the scale of the homeless catastrophe facing this country and indicative of the challenge facing voluntary and community organizations trying to address it. Related to that is the issue of traveller housing. Traveller housing was 40 million in 2008. It fell back to a very low level, as you can see, after austerity, 4 million. It has climbed back to 20 million. It is now 21 million, an increase of 1 million. Despite the continuing traveller accommodation crisis, despite criticism of the European Court of, the Council of Europe, and there is still no move to establishing an agency for traveller accommodation on the model that was developed in Northern Ireland to address discrimination there. So the picture for travellers remains, based on budgetary figures, a very grim and challenging one. If we look at human rights, there is an increase in the budget for the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, up from 8.1 million to 8.6 million. And the Human Rights Commission is important because it's a champion of voluntary and community organisations and their issues, and because human rights extend across a wide range of activity in the voluntary and community sector, from refugees to homeless people and so on. But it is legitimate to us to make a comparison with the equivalent two agencies in Northern Ireland, because their accumulated funding is more. It's 9.9 million for the equivalent of the IHREC in Northern Ireland. But that's for a population of 1.9 million compared to over 5 million here. So I think that's indicative of the level of commitment and improvement to human rights work in this state. I'm now going to come on to some particular social welfare rates. And again, this has to be compared. And this is a comparison not against 2008, but a comparison against last year. We see an increase in supplementary welfare allowance, which is the basic welfare net. Even more important, the additional needs payments, emergency payments, particularly important in the event of cost of living, energy and related emergencies, up 3.9%. Community employment, very important for voluntary and community groups, the main user of the scheme, down 5%. Ditto the rural social scheme, very stable at 0.2%. TOOS is down 13%. The Jobs Initiative, 5.5%. The Back to Education Allowance, BTEA, is down a lot more, nearly a third. Clothing and footwear is up, and school meals are doubled, and that will be an improvement welcomed by many. I think it's careful not to overread these changes because they're demand-led. So the demand may vary over the years. So a cutback does not necessarily represent an actual cutback. It may represent less demand, but they are important for voluntary and community groups, particularly with community employment, particularly in rural development, and particularly for children who are the beneficiaries of the ones on the bottom lines. They've been historically stable, like community employment, and the significant change is the extension of school meals. If we look at the crucial safety net represented by supplementary welfare allowance, we still have a contrast where it was 233 million at the point of austerity, but it's still a lot less than that. The levels are still lower. However, the actual amount spent last year was greater than that allocated, indicating a certain level of responsiveness. And ditto the more important, I think, additional needs payments Again, they're up and they're projected to be up further from 66 million last year upwards. So the ANP system is showing a certain level of responsiveness. It's an under-publicized system, I think, and it is something that is very important as the safety net for advice services, for proximity services, and for voluntary and community organizations working at the coalface on those in the greatest social need. But again, we still face a system that the overall level of safety net provision is still lower than it was at the point of austerity, showing the relevance, again, I think, of the 2008 anchor point and the implications of that for our overall social policy. On the subject of which, one of the most important frontline services for families in need has always been the family resource centres introduced in the late 1990s. It has only just recovered its pre-austerity level of 18.05 million. Yet particularly in the COVID period, it faced hugely increased demand when its funding did not increase. So here we have a very vital service, which, based on the statistics, is underfunded compared to what it was in the past. And this takes no account of the general increase in government funding that has taken place over the past number of years. So it remains, from the figures, an underfunded frontline service. I now want to come to some of the main headings of funding for voluntary and community groups to see what has gone up and what has gone down. And I want to refer you at the right to the 45.7% benchmark, which was the increase in state funding overall from 2008 to 2023. Note, these are last year's figures because we do not have this level of detail yet for 2024. As you can see, voluntary housing has risen over this period, which shows the way in which the government has moved the balance of social housing from the local authority sector to the voluntary and community sector, with the voluntary housing budget up there to 190.9 million. Sports has been a huge beneficiary of funding since over the past number of years, and is way, way far above wherever it was in pre-austerity. So the government has very clearly identified sports as one of the main areas where funding should be and has been increased. Health I've already dealt with. The Arts Council, you can see, is also a substantial beneficiary above the overall level of government spending. Migrant services are up very significantly this year, but that is probably a reflection of the need to assist the refugees from Ukraine. Family resource centres are up, but still we're only on approximately the austerity level of funding. Probation services up 11%, women's organisations up 9.7%. But you can also see that the funding there is only just over $500,000. It is very small compared to the other organisations, and one suspects the level of the challenges that still face women's inequality. National supports for voluntary and community organisations are finally above the 2008 level by 6.7% at 19 million. But again, I come back to the figure on your bottom right. They should be, if they shared in the increase in figures since 2008, be at 45.7% above. And now we look at funding which has not recovered absolutely at all, never mind relatively. And these are the Community Services Programme, which is the social economy, Irish Emigrant Abroad, voluntary youth organisations, and most remarkably of all, local development and SICAP, the social inclusion local programme. And that is still 35.4% below its austerity level. I've done a summary here. Sorry, excuse me. Let me do the SICAP one first. This shows how the funding for SICAP and local development fell from 81 million at the point of austerity down to its current still very low point. But there is a projection for an increase next year, which should bring it marginally back up again, which would give us 56.96 million for next year, but that's still 30% below where it was historically. And you can see there on the bottom line, the very stable but low level of funding for national voluntary organisations over the entire post-austerity period. If we come now, and this is essentially a percentage repeat of what you've been seeing in a moment there, the winners in the voluntary and community sector since 2008 are voluntary housing, sports, health and arts. Those who have recovered are probation, family resource centres, women's organisations, national voluntary organisations and migrant integration. The losers are still local development, youth organisations and immigrant organisations. And they would all be, if purely relative priorities were maintained across the board, 53.27% up. So the relative decline of this whole area of social spending is all the more evident. My question is, what is the thinking and what is the justification for these patterns and priorities? Granted that we have a substantial youth population, why are youth organisations still funded less than 16.5%? Why was local development, a flagship in Europe, still a third less than 2008? Was this ever evaluated? Was this ever considered? Was it ever looked at by the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, IGES, mentioned below there? Why have we never had a statement from Ministers of Finance or any other ministers to explain and justify the differences that are there here? They've simply happened, but have never been explained or justified. We've never heard a rationale for these changes. And just finally, I'm going to say a little bit about two important areas of spending for voluntary and community groups, which are the National Lottery and dormant accounts. The reason why I do this is because these two funds are repeatedly raised as issues. Most people believe, including people in voluntary and community organisations, that the lottery and dormant accounts goes to voluntary and community groups. The lottery is supposed to go to good causes in youth, sports, recreation, arts, culture, heritage and the Irish language. And that is where the money goes, according to the figures that we have. But essentially these go into exchequer budget lines. There is very little transparency in this system. Most of what are called the final beneficiaries, who actually ends up with the actual money, is not identified. A particular issue here is that one of the largest allocations is in the middle there, private housing grants. We don't know who these people are. We don't know who the beneficiaries there. And I would particularly question, how is that a good cause? Undoubtedly, the people who get these grants benefit, but how is it a good cause in terms of national allocations? By contrast, in Northern Ireland, there are 663 grants worth £27.9 million to voluntary organisations. And you can identify these, and the schemes are published, and there's an open call for proposals for such grants. There is no system like that here. The money is simply allocated into some of these groups through the main government budget line. So it's essentially it's an accounting mechanism. After the Indicon report in 2022, the minister did agree to an open fund. I certainly haven't seen that yet, but maybe it is coming, but it is not so far evident from the estimates. If we look at dormant accounts, they are for issues of economic, social, educational disadvantage and people with disabilities, 54.6 million in 2022. But likewise, these are spread across 46 measures in 10 government departments, ranging from 30,000 for adventure sports to 7.355 million for disability sports. However, some of it is still government spending, like Housing First, Oberstown House, and the prison service. Some of it is for voluntary organisations, and you can identify in the reports the Veterans Association and Jigsaw. Dormant accounts does have an annual plan and report, but that raises the question of why does not the lottery? If we go 100 miles to the north, in Northern Ireland, dormant accounts are also open call, self-standing funds where we can identify the beneficiaries, who are 106 organisations getting 9.6 million. And I come back to the fact that we have a public perception that all this money goes directly to voluntary and community organisations. That is not the case, either for the lottery or dormant accounts. In reality, they are exchequer substituting supplemental funds allocated by and between departments according to their priorities. And I think from the point of view of social policy and public administration, they are piecemeal, small scale, a minimalist approach to social challenges. We still can't identify the beneficiaries in many cases. An opportunity to be strategic, I think, has been missed. And it's very difficult to see any true additionality to voluntary and community groups. And it is such a dramatic contrast to Northern Ireland. The contrast could not be greater. So just very finally, the budget is set against the treble shock of austerity, COVID, and the war. Spending is up 52%, more than half on 2008. There is a combination of general measures and cost of living measures, but the actual level of inflation will be critical. All social welfare payments are below the poverty line. The budget is not used as a strategic instrument for poverty reduction, especially in the case of child poverty. An unchanged housing policy will lead to more pressure on voluntary and community organisations, an increase in homelessness, a continued challenge for travellers, still funded almost half less than before. In voluntary and community groups, you can see, and I won't go over the winners, those who have an absolute but not relative recovery, the losers, particularly young people and local development, the underinvestment compared to Northern Ireland in human rights, missing, I come back to the point that Ivan made at the very beginning, the situation of Section 39 organisations not addressed in the budget, and state-centric lottery and dormant account allocations, unlike the other part of our shared island. So thank you very much for listening. Please send any corrections and errors. You have my email there at the bottom. Thank you.
Okay, Brian, thank you very much. I just want to say for the concision also with which you have presented this morning. I'm always just struck by the extraordinary range of policy areas that you cover, and of course that the community and voluntary sector as a whole has a stake in, across all of these functions of modern government and modern service provision in a democracy. So it also, I think, your presentation reveals the complexity of interpreting changes in gross numbers, let's call it, in the absence of detailed information underneath those gross numbers in relation to how those numbers are being applied. And of course, it all takes place in the context of the increase in the cost of living crisis we currently have, and the wider context that you indicated of the post-2008 austerity period. So I'm just often left with this sense that, absence sometimes, I think, in the budgetary context is this sense of the guiding strategy or guiding vision that underpins the budget, and this where that's coming from. And all I would say is that I think that, we certainly should have a context where income adequacy and quality services are available to all people together, because taken together, it's those two factors that lead to us being able to sustain high levels of well-being for all our people. And the most vulnerable people, I think, everyone here today would agree, need to be focused on first and foremost if we are to have the fair and just society that we certainly want, and we assume all political parties in the Dáil want as well. So look, thank you very much, Brian. You've given us lots of food for thought there. The slides will be circulated to everybody along with a video of today's proceedings, and we're very happy for those to be shared widely. I think, folks, everybody can see the enormous task that Brian undertakes every year in producing this analysis, and the consistent way that he has produced it over the years, which allows, I think, very interesting and insightful conclusions to be come to in relation to where our priorities as a nation are. So I'd like to thank him for that. It's no easy feat producing this type of analysis. So with that said, I probably just feel it's time to draw the proceedings to a conclusion. I'll just come back to the point, Brian mentioned it, I had mentioned it earlier on. If there is any feedback, make sure that we do email it back to us, and we'll relay it to Brian or email it to Brian directly. And also in the context of the strike action that has been called for next week, it's exercising everybody's minds. Okay, we in the Wheel are working very closely with our colleague networks and federations such as Disability Federation of Ireland, the network of TUSTA-funded organisations, the homeless networks, homeless services networks in the national context. And of course the section the section 56 TUSLA organizations of the section 39s. We're working with all of the networks and federations. I hope members will have seen the communications that we've been putting out to try and keep this issue top of the political agenda. There's no doubt that we are communicating across the unions at this point, just to try to understand and encouraging government to do everything it possibly can to resolve this situation before we're faced with really an unthinkable crisis next week, unless action is taken to resolve it. It should never have come to this, and we would just be, I as CEO of the Wheel, I'm appealing to anybody here who can bring influence to bear to resolve this situation, and calling on government to engage with the trades unions to resolve this issue, and to make sure that all of the organisations in these categories have sufficient funding available to them for them to pay the sustainable rate and ensure equal pay for equal work for people doing the same work. That's what it boils down to, and that's the solution that's needed. So, Brian, thank you again. Okay, it's an extraordinary budget moment, this, for the sector. You've done us a service, and we look forward to continuing to work with you, Brian. And please do provide us with any feedback you have, folks, so we can continue to improve our general post-budget work. And watch this space for further developments next week. And fingers crossed is all I can say, that sense will prevail and people who have the power to resolve this issue, because funding availability isn't the issue, that people who have the power to resolve this issue make the right choices. Thank you very much, everybody, and good luck for now. Okay, bye.